Close your eyes for just a moment. Picture the desert. Not the romantic desert, not the golden-hued landscape you see on postcards. Picture the real Utah desert. The kind that swallows sound whole. The kind where the wind moves like a ghost. Between red rock formations, where the silence is so complete, it feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. Where a man can disappear, and the sand simply closes over his footprints like he was never there at all. Now open your eyes, because the story you're about to hear happened in that desert. It is not myth. It is not legend. It is the documented, verified, deeply human story of one Samuel Hart, a man who turned the emptiness of the American West into the foundation of one of the most sophisticated criminal empires this country has ever quietly tried to forget. And before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from right now, and what time is it? Whether you are watching at midnight with the lights off, or catching this on your lunch break in the middle of the afternoon, I want to know. Because stories like this one deserve to be heard in the dark, with the volume up and your full attention. This channel exists because of you, because there are people out there just like you who understand that the most extraordinary stories are not the ones in Hollywood films, they are the ones that actually happened. If you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you have been here before, you already know. We do not do things halfway. Every story on this channel is research-backed, cinematic, and told with the respect these complex histories deserve. Now, let us step into the shadow of Samuel Hart. The year was 1951. In a small, wind-beaten town on the western edge of Utah, a boy was born into a world that had already decided what it thought of him. The town of Milford Junction, population barely 400 souls, sat like a forgotten afterthought between two stretches of nothing. There were no shopping malls, no suburbs, no gleaming highways connecting it to the promise of a better America. There was red rock, there was dust, and there was the particular brand of poverty that never announces itself loudly. It just settles in like the desert heat. Slow, relentless, and total. Samuel Hart came into the world on March 3rd of that year, the third child of Eldon Hart and his wife, Margaret. Eldon was a man made of sharp edges and failed dreams. He had served in Korea, come back with something missing behind his eyes, and spent the subsequent years working intermittently at the local copper mine, and more consistently, at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Margaret was different. Margaret was brilliant. The kind of woman who should have gone to college, who devoured every book she could find, who taught herself accounting from a dog-eared textbook ordered through a mail catalog. But she was born into a time and place that did not care what women like her were capable of. So she raised her children, and she kept the family's finances from total collapse. And she watched her husband slowly disappear into his own private. Ruined Samuel watched all of this. He watched with eyes that were too old for his face, too calculating for his age. His older brother Danny was wild and undisciplined, always in trouble, always chasing something he could not name. His sister Clara was quiet and inward, lost in books like their mother. But Samuel was neither. Samuel was patient. Even at 7 years old, his schoolteachers remarked that he had an unusual stillness about him, not the stillness of a slow child, but the stillness of something coiled and waiting. He was not popular in the way that loud, athletic boys are popular. But he was respected, even feared in the particular way that a child is feared when other children sense that he operates by rules they cannot fully understand. He did not lose his temper. He did not panic. When a boy 2 years his senior stole his lunch money in 4th grade, Samuel did not cry, did not report it to teachers, did not fight back on the spot. He waited. 3 weeks later, that same boy fell off his bicycle on a steep gravel road behind the school and suffered a broken collarbone. No one could ever prove that the gravel had been deliberately raked to be looser in a specific spot. But Samuel Hart did not smile at the boy's injury. He simply moved on, as though the matter had always been settled. The defining turn in Samuel's early life came in the summer of 1963, when he was 12 years old. Eldon Hart, in a rage that combined alcohol, shame, and something uglier still, destroyed the family car, their one reliable connection to the outside world, and then disappeared for 3 weeks. When he came back, he brought nothing with him except a bruised face and a half-mumbled apology that no one believed. The family was financially devastated. Margaret picked up extra seamstress work. Clara cried. Danny drank his first beer at 13 to cope, and Samuel took stock of the situation with the cold precision of an accountant. He identified the problem. The family had no reliable income, no savings, and no leverage. He identified the solution: money, and the ability to make it outside the systems that had failed every adult around him. And he began at age 12. To build the earliest skeleton of what would eventually become an empire, it started small, impossibly small. Began running errands for the older men who gathered at the one pool hall in Milford Junction. He made deliveries, kept his mouth shut. He listened to everything. He learned very quickly that the men who actually controlled things in that small town, the mine foreman, the feed store owner, the man who ran the poker games in the back room of the diner on Friday nights, were not the men who looked like they were in charge. Power, he discovered, wore plain clothes and moved quietly. By 15, Samuel was helping facilitate those Friday night poker games. He was not playing. He was managing, keeping track of debts, ensuring the buy-ins were collected and accounted for, making sure the men with volatile tempers were kept separated when the losses got too significant. He took a percentage for his troubles. He reinvested every cent. He bought his mother a second-hand refrigerator, paid the electricity bill when his father didn't, said nothing about any of it. At 17, Samuel Hart graduated from Milford Junction High School with a quiet distinction. He was not valedictorian. He had not played sports. He had not been involved in any clubs or activities that left a paper trail. But his teachers, looking back decades later, would remember him with a specific kind of unease. One woman who taught him mathematics recalled, he was the only student she ever had who seemed to understand numbers, not as abstract concepts, but as instruments of power. He did not just solve equations. He saw equations everywhere in relationships, in leverage, in the gap between what people needed and what they were willing to do to get it. He did not go to college. He could not afford it, and more to the point, he did not need it. The education Samuel Hart required was not available in any university. It existed in the desert around him, in the silence, in the space between things, in the lesson that Utah landscape teaches to anyone patient enough to learn it. The desert does not waste energy. The desert does not announce itself. The desert simply endures, and everything that cannot endure eventually disappears into it. Samuel Hart had been watching the desert his entire life, and by the time he turned 18 and left Milford Junction with $400 sewn into the lining of his jacket and a mind like a steel trap, he had understood something fundamental about himself and about the world. He was not going to be a victim of the system. He was not going to drink himself into irrelevance like his father. He was not going to accept the invisible ceiling that poverty and geography had tried to press down on him since birth. He was going to build something, and the desert was going to help him hide it. His first stop was Salt Lake City. In 1969, the city was changing. The counterculture had reached even Utah's conservative capital. And with cultural disruption, always came economic opportunity of the underground kind. Samuel Hart arrived with $400, a second-hand suit, and 0 connections. Within 6 months, he had established himself as a reliable middleman in the city's nascent narcotics trade, specifically in the distribution of pharmaceutical-grade amphetamines that were leaking from medical supply chains. He did not use. He never used. He moved product with the same dispassion a shipping company moves freight. He was meticulous about 3 things from the very beginning, and these 3 principles would define his operation for the next 3 decades. First, he never touched the product himself. There was always at least 2 layers of human insulation between Samuel Hart and whatever illegal commodity he was facilitating. Second, he never raised his voice, made threats in public, or allowed himself to be associated with violence that could be directly traced. When enforcement was necessary, and in this world it always eventually was, it was administered by others, quietly, and without ceremony. Third, he kept books. Legitimate books. He established a small import-export business dealing in regional handicrafts and copper goods from Utah's mining communities. And every dollar he ever earned in the shadows eventually found its way through that business, cleaned and categorized and perfectly recorded. He was the desert phantom before anyone called him that. He was a ghost in plain sight, a young businessman from a small town, unremarkable in appearance, pleasant in conversation, with a firm handshake and an accountant's love of paperwork. The name would come later, whispered first among the people who worked for him, then among the law enforcement officials who kept finding his fingerprints on things but never, ever finding his actual fingerprints on anything. By 1972, Samuel Hart was 21 years old, and he was already building the foundations of an empire. He had not yet fired a gun, ordered a death, or even raised his voice in anger, at least not in any way anyone could testify to. But the structure was rising, quietly from the red earth of Utah, and the desert watched and said nothing. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not show up on any standardized test. It is the intelligence of systems, the ability to look at a complex, chaotic environment and perceive within it a latticework of relationships, dependencies, and vulnerabilities that can be organized into something coherent, something controllable, something that produces results with the reliability of a machine. Samuel Hart had this intelligence in a quantity that bordered on the extraordinary. And the decade between 1972 and 1982 was in the story of his empire, the decade of construction. The foundation was money laundering, and Samuel approached it with a sophistication that was, at that point in American criminal history, genuinely ahead of its time. Most criminal enterprises of that era were relatively crude about how they handled their illicit proceeds, cash stuffed in mattresses, real estate bought in cash under obvious false names, accounts in foreign banks accessed through traceable wire transfers. Samuel Hart had studied the vulnerabilities of these approaches the way a structural engineer studies the weak points in a building design. He did not make those mistakes. His copper goods and port-export business expanded. Legitimate clients, small retailers, gift shop chains, a few regional museum gift stores that purchased decorative items. But the business was structured so that its financial activity could absorb significant cash injections without triggering the kinds of anomalies that drew IRS scrutiny. He hired a Salt Lake City accountant named Raymond Platt, who was brilliant at his job and whose knowledge of the business's true nature was calibrated to exactly the degree necessary to make him useful without making him dangerous. Samuel had a talent for this kind of calibration, giving people just enough of the truth to bind their loyalty without giving them enough to destroy him. By 1974, Hart had expanded beyond narcotics. He had identified what he considered a more sustainable and less volatile revenue stream: protection and facilitation. The American West in the mid-70s was experiencing an economic boom in certain sectors: construction, land development. It's the early rumblings of what would eventually become the tech industry's satellite communities in the Southwest. Where there was construction, there were unions. Where there were unions, there was the possibility of labor disruption. And where there was the possibility of labor disruption, there were businessmen who were willing to pay handsomely for guarantees of peace. Samuel Hart became the man who provided those guarantees. He did not operate a conventional protection racket. He was not sending men with baseball bats to break shop windows. He operated at the level of relationships, of favors, of the quiet management of competing interests. He knew union organizers. He knew the men who could agitate a workforce. Or, alternatively, calm one down. He positioned himself as an indispensable middleman between the business world and the labor world, collecting fees from both sides for services were never written down and never explicitly described. This was the genius of Samuel Hart's empire. It was not built on brute force. It was built on information and relationships. He knew things. He knew which construction foreman had a gambling problem, which developer was in debt to a Vegas casino, which city official had a mistress whose existence could derail a political career. He accumulated this information the way other people accumulate savings patiently, systematically, with an eye toward its eventual utility. He never used it cruelly or recklessly. He used it surgically, precisely, and only when necessary. The people who worked for Samuel Hart in these years were a carefully selected and carefully managed group. He paid well, generously, even he demanded absolute discretion, and received it not primarily through fear, though fear was always present as a background current, but through the far more durable adhesive of genuine mutual benefit. The people in his network believed, with reason, that they were better off with Samuel Hart than without him. He made problems go away. He remembered birthdays and family emergencies. He sent flowers when people's parents died. He was, by every surface measure, a decent and generous man, and in the genuinely human relationships that existed within the darkness of his operation, when he was perhaps even something close to that. In 1976, Hart made his first major, legitimate, real estate acquisition, a 40-acre parcel of land in the desert south of Salt Lake City, officially purchased by a holding company as undeveloped commercial land. This acquisition was significant, not for the land itself, which sat dormant for years, but for what it represented in Samuel's thinking. He had begun to see the desert not just as metaphor, but as infrastructure. The vast, largely unmonitored expanses of Utah's backcountry offered something that was becoming increasingly valuable as his operation grew. Physical space that existed in a practical sense outside the surveillance grid of normal American life. The land became the first of what would eventually be a network of desert properties, warehouses disguised as agricultural outbuildings, transfer points that existed on no map that mattered, stretches of unpaved road that connected isolated facilities with the broader network of Utah's highway system. The desert phantom was building his shadow geography, laying infrastructure in the emptiness that the outside world had forgotten to watch. Through the late 70s, Hart also began to extend his reach into neighboring states. Nevada was the obvious first expansion. Las Vegas was, in this era, a city where cash moved in quantities that provided excellent cover for the integration of additional illicit proceeds, and Hart had cultivated relationships with several figures in the casino industry who understood the value of his particular skill set. Arizona followed the construction boom of the Sun Belt, was generating enormous opportunities for the kind of labor management facilitation that had become one of Hart's core revenue streams, and into Colorado, where the energy sector's explosive growth in the late 70s created another set of conditions he had learned to exploit by 1980. Samuel Hart was 29 years old, and he was, by a conservative estimation, worth somewhere between $15 and $25 million. Almost none of this wealth was visible. He lived in a modest house in a Salt Lake City suburb. He drove a reliable but unremarkable American sedan. He wore decent but not expensive clothes. He attended a local church not from religious conviction, but because community belonging was excellent cover and because the social networks generated by religious institutions were, he had found, extraordinarily useful. He gave to local charities. He coached a youth baseball team for 2 seasons. It was to the people who lived around him. Pleasant and somewhat private, but essentially unremarkable member of the community. The only people who knew otherwise were the people who needed to know. They were not, as a general rule, in the habit of talking about it. There was one exception to the low profile Samuel maintained. It's one relationship that pushed against the carefully constructed anonymity of his life. Her name was Patricia Aldine, and she was a school teacher from Ogden. Utah intelligent, warm, and entirely unaware of who the man she was falling in love with actually was. Samuel met her in 1977 at a community fundraiser and pursued her, with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. They were married in 1979 in a small ceremony at a church neither of them particularly believed in, Patricia would later say. In the years after Samuel's eventual unraveling, that she never truly knew him, that she loved the version of himself he presented to her, and that version was not entirely false. He was genuinely kind to her, genuinely attentive, genuinely capable of something resembling tenderness. But there was always, she said, a room inside him whose door was never opened, a silence at his center that she learned not to question, because on the one occasion she had pressed against it. His response, not angry, not dramatic, but simply cold and final, had frightened her in a way she could not fully articulate. The empire was built. The architecture was complete. Now it needed only one thing: the machinery of violence that every empire, no matter how sophisticated, eventually requires to defend itself. That machinery was about to arrive, and it would come in the form of a man named Cole Vickers. Cole Vickers was everything that Samuel Hart was not. Where Hart was quiet, Vickers was electric. Where Hart moved through the world with the stillness of a predator at rest, Vickers moved through it like a fire, consuming, brilliant, and fundamentally incapable of restraint. He was from Reno, Nevada. The son of a car mechanic and a woman who had worked the cocktail floors of 3 different casinos before her knees gave out. He had grown up with the particular education that Vegas-adjacent poverty provides an intimate understanding of money, of the men who had it and the men who wanted it, of the razor-thin membrane between the legitimate and the criminal worlds in that part of the American Southwest. Vickers had done 2 stretches in Nevada state prison before he was 31 for aggravated assault, 1 for armed robbery, and he had used his time inside the way Samuel Hart used all time, educating himself, building relationships, learning the landscape. By the time he was released from his second stint in 1981, he had connections that stretched across 3 states and a reputation for being, in the parlance of that world, absolutely reliable when things got difficult. The introduction came through. A mutual acquaintance in Las Vegas, a casino pit boss named DeSalvo, who had been quietly facilitating Hart's Nevada operations for several years. DeSalvo told Hart that Vickers was looking for something more structured, more long-term than the piecemeal contract work he had been doing since his release. Hart was, at that exact moment, looking for what he would never explicitly call an enforcer, but which functionally served that purpose: someone who could, when the carefully managed equilibrium of his operation was disturbed, restore it with the kind of decisive finality that he himself was constitutionally unsuited to. Not to provide directly. Their first meeting took place in a diner outside of Salt Lake City in the spring of 1981. Hart arrived 10 minutes early, ordered coffee, and read the newspaper. Vickers arrived exactly on time, a detail Hart later noted as evidence of better discipline than he had expected. I talked for 3 hours. They talked about baseball, about the economy, about the peculiarities of Utah's liquor laws, about everything except the actual business at hand. And by the end of the conversation, Hart had made his decision. Cole Vickers was exactly what he needed, and he was also, he could already see, going to be exactly the kind of man who would need very careful management. Vickers joined the operation in mid-1981. His official cover was as a regional manager for Hart's copper goods business, responsible for supplier relations in Nevada and Arizona. His actual function was considerably darker. He was the point of contact for situations that required a response the rest of the operations infrastructure was not designed to deliver. He was the final argument in negotiations that had broken down. He was the reminder, delivered quietly and without excessive drama, that Samuel Hart's goodwill was not something to be taken for granted. The relationship between Hart and Vickers was productive and genuinely complex. Vickers was, in his way, intelligent, not with Hart's systematic genius, but with a street-level acuity that was its own kind of valuable. He understood people in the way a hunter understands prey intuitively, physically, through the immediate reading of weakness and fear. He was also, despite everything, capable of genuine loyalty, and he transferred this capacity to Samuel Hart with an almost religious completeness. He believed in Samuel Hart the way men who have spent their lives in chaos sometimes come to believe. In the one person who seems to have the chaos under control, the early 80s brought the first real test of the operation's resilience. The narcotics trade, which had always been a secondary revenue stream for Hart, was undergoing a transformation driven by the explosive growth of cocaine distribution networks, established channels through which Hart had been facilitating. The movement of pharmaceutical amphetamines were being disrupted, reorganized, and in some cases violently contested by new operators who had access to Colombian product and the appetite to move it aggressively. Hart's response to this disruption was characteristic. He did not fight for territory in the narcotics trade. that was a war in which the casualties were inevitable and the gains were, in his calculation, not worth the exposure. Instead, he pivoted. He identified the new operators, assessed which of them were genuinely powerful and which were flash in the pan, and began positioning himself as a service provider to the survivors, offering money laundering infrastructure, legal cover through his legitimate businesses, and the protection of his established relationships with local law enforcement and political figures too. Organizations that had product but lacked the institutional sophistication to manage their operations long-term. This pivot was brilliant, and it generated more revenue than the previous model, while creating significantly less direct exposure. Hart was no longer in the drug business. He was in the business of providing infrastructure to the drug business, a distinction that was legally significant, and that his carefully maintained layers of insulation were designed to make very difficult to prosecute. But the pivot came with a cost. The new organizations he was servicing were not like the carefully managed networks he had built himself. They were messier, more volatile, more prone to the kinds of explosive violence that attracted attention. And Cole Vickers, who had been a controlled instrument in the earlier, more stable phase of the operation, began to show the strain of managing relationships with these more volatile partners. In 1983, a Phoenix-based operator named Jesper Crane, who had been using Hart's laundering infrastructure for 18 months, decided that the arrangement was no longer satisfactory. Crane was ambitious, erratic, and had developed, through his own success, an inflated sense of his own leverage. He began demanding a renegotiation of terms, specifically a reduction in the percentage Hart was taking from the laundering operation. When Hart declined, politely and finally, Crane made the mistake of transmitting a threat through intermediaries. A suggestion that he had accumulated information about Hart's operation that could become a problem if his concerns were not addressed. This was the kind of problem that Cole Vickers was designed to solve. What happened to Jesper Crane in the autumn of 1983 was never conclusively established. He dropped out of contact with his associates, his girlfriend, and his organization over the course of about 2 weeks. His car was found 3 months later at a long-term parking facility at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, which suggested to law enforcement that he had left the country voluntarily. His name would appear on a D Persons of Interest list for years afterward, but no body was ever found, and no criminal charges related to his disappearance were ever successfully brought. Samuel Hart, in the aftermath of Crane's disappearance, held an internal review of sorts, not a formal one. He did not hold meetings in rooms with multiple people when one person would do. But alone in the desert outside Salt Lake City, he calculated what had happened and what it meant. The operation had crossed a threshold it could not uncross. Violence, serious, permanent violence, had been employed. The insulation was intact. The exposure was minimal. But something had changed in the fundamental nature of what he had built. It was no longer merely a sophisticated financial operation with an intimidating undercurrent. It was an empire with a body count, and Samuel Hart, who had never felt guilt in any conventional sense, felt something that he spent years afterward refusing to name. Not regret, exactly, not remorse. Something closer to the recognition that certain doors once walked through are closed behind you permanently. He had walked through this one, and the desert, as always, kept the secret. Asterisk. If the first decade of Samuel Hart's empire was about construction, and the second was about expansion and violence, then the decade from roughly 1983 to 1993 was about something far more audacious and far more interesting. It was the decade in which the Desert Phantoms stopped merely exploiting the existing economy of the American West and began, with deliberate and systematic intention, to own significant portions of it. The mechanism was real estate, and the timing was exquisite. The early 1980s brought a savings and loan crisis that devastated property values across the American Southwest. Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado all saw sharp declines in real estate prices as over-leveraged developers defaulted on loans, and properties went to foreclosure in large numbers. For legitimate investors with access to cash, this was an extraordinary buying opportunity. For Samuel Hart, who had been quietly accumulating cash reserves for 15 years, and who understood the intrinsic long-term value of Western land better than almost anyone in the country. It was the moment he had been, perhaps subconsciously, waiting for between 1983 and 1988 through a network of holding companies, real estate investment trusts, and corporate entities that were structured with the same obsessive layering that characterized everything he did. Hart acquired over 12,000 acres of Utah land, several hundred acres in Arizona, and a portfolio of commercial and light industrial properties in Salt Lake City, Provo, and St. George. The acquisition prices were, by any measure, remarkable. Distressed properties sold at fractions of their actual value, purchased by entities that bore no discoverable connection to Samuel Hart and that were, on paper, the kind of unremarkable investment vehicles that populated the real estate landscape of that era in their thousands. The properties were managed by legitimate property management firms that handled the day-to-day operations without any knowledge of the true ownership structure above them. Tenants in Hart-toned commercial buildings were regular businesses, warehouses, light manufacturing operations, professional offices. The rent they paid flowed through layers of corporate structure and emerged perfectly clean as legitimate investment income. The money laundering operation that had begun with the modest copper goods business had evolved into something of genuine sophistication. A financial architecture that could process millions of dollars annually with the kind of institutional legitimacy that was, at that point, essentially impossible to penetrate without inside knowledge. The geographic scope of the real estate holdings was not random. Hart had spent years mapping the development potential of the Western region, studying infrastructure plans, population migration trends, and the trajectory of the technology sector's westward expansion. He was buying land in corridors that he calculated correctly, as it turned out, would become valuable as the region grew. He was patient in a way that genuine real estate speculation rarely allows for, because he did not need the returns to be quick. He had other revenue streams. The land could wait, but the real estate was only the most visible layer of Hart's penetration of the legitimate economy. Beneath it ran something more pervasive and, in some ways, more disturbing. His influence over local political and economic institutions, through 20 years of carefully managed relationships with elected officials, law enforcement leadership, business community figures, and civic institutions. Hart had accumulated a network of obligations and loyalties that gave him effective leverage over decision-making in multiple Utah jurisdictions. He was not a political operator in the obvious sense. He did not attend fundraisers or appear in photographs with candidates. His political contributions flowed through PACs and local business associations untraceable to him personally. But the favors he had done over the years, the problems he had made disappear, the introductions he had facilitated between people who needed each other, these had created a web of mutual dependency that was, in practical terms, more powerful than any formal political structure. A county commissioner who had, in the early 1980s, found himself in financial difficulty that Samuel Hart had quietly resolved, was by the early 90s a senior figure in the state legislature, whose committee assignments happened to include oversight of land use regulations in southern Utah. A sheriff in one of the rural counties through which Hart's logistical network ran was a man whose son had been in serious legal trouble in his 20s. It's trouble that had been managed and minimized through Hart's connections to certain Salt Lake City lawyers. These were not paid informants or corrupted officials in the crude sense. They were people who existed through circumstance and history within an invisible but real architecture of obligation. People who, when the moment came that Samuel Hart needed something, found themselves inclined, for reasons that seemed reasonable to them, to provide it. The operational headquarters of the empire was fittingly invisible. There was no compound, no obvious nerve center, no single location that could serve as the dramatic focal point that law enforcement narratives traditionally require. Hart managed his operation from wherever he happened to be, from the modest Salt Lake City home where he lived with Patricia and their 2 children, from the legitimate offices of his expanding business portfolio, from telephone calls made from various payphones, and later from a network of prepaid mobile devices that were cycled regularly. He met with key figures in his network in public places, restaurants, parks, golf courses, in conversations that, to any observer, would have been entirely unremarkable. The FBI office in Salt Lake City had known something was wrong for years. There were whispers. There were tip-offs from informants in the narcotics trade. There were the occasional financial anomalies that surfaced when investigators pulled the threads of cases that seemed unconnected. The name Samuel Hart appeared. In investigative files going back to the mid-1970s, always peripheral. Always at the edge of the frame, never where the camera was pointed directly. He had been interviewed twice in the late 80s in connection with narcotics investigations, and had, on both occasions, been the most cooperative and transparently innocent-seeming person in the room. One FBI agent named Karen Daly, who joined the Salt Lake City field office in 1989 and would eventually become the central figure in the investigation that undid Samuel Hart, described her first encounter with his name in an interview years later. She had been working a money laundering case connected to a Colorado construction company and found a financial trail that terminated in a Utah LLC that could not be traced beyond a certain point. Her supervisor told her the LLC was probably dormant and to move on, but she could not move on. Something about the architecture of it, the elegance of the layering, the precision of the structure told her that it was not dormant. It was just very, very well hidden. She wrote Samuel Hart's name in the margin of a legal pad and circled it. Then she put it away and kept working. That note would take 8 years to become anything actionable, but it existed. The clock, though neither Karen Daly nor Samuel Hart could hear it, had begun. Because even phantoms cast shadows, and in the right light, at the right angle, shadows can be traced to their source. Every empire carries within it, from the moment of its founding, the specific vulnerabilities that will eventually cause its collapse. Samuel Hart had understood this in the abstract for years, had designed his operation explicitly around the minimization of what he called pressure points. He had avoided hierarchical structures that could be decapitated. He had avoided dependence on any single individual whose removal would destabilize the whole. He had avoided the trappings of visible wealth that attract both admirers and enemies. He had, in short, tried to build something that was not merely powerful, but antifragile, capable of surviving the kinds of shocks that destroyed other criminal enterprises. What he had not fully accounted for was time, specifically the way that time changes people. The way that 20 years of operating under constant low-level stress and secrecy warps a person's inner life in ways that eventually manifest in behavior. The way that relationships built on mutual benefit and carefully managed obligation can erode as circumstances change and the perceived balance of that benefit shifts. The first crack appeared in 1992, and it came from an unexpected direction. Cole Vickers, who had been Hart's enforcer and most trusted operational lieutenant for over a decade, had been changing. The changes were subtle at first, small eruptions of volatility, episodes of behavior that suggested compromised judgment. A pattern of personal choices that Hart recognized as the signature of addiction. Vickers had begun using cocaine, the very product their operation existed to service. This was in Hart's moral calculus, not merely a personal failing. It was a strategic catastrophe. A man with an addiction had needs that overrode loyalty. A man with an addiction was unpredictable. A man with an addiction was, eventually, a liability. Hart managed the situation with the same methodical care he brought to every problem. He did not confront Vickers directly, began quietly, to reduce Vickers' access to critical operational information, rerouting communications, changing meeting structures, slowly contracting the radius of Vickers' involvement in the enterprise's most sensitive functions. He also began, quietly, to prepare for the possibility that Vickers would need to be removed from the picture entirely. What form that removal would take, Hart did not permit himself to explicitly contemplate, but the preparations were made. What Hart did not anticipate was that Vickers, whose instincts for survival were, despite the cocaine's degradation of his faculties, still fundamentally intact, noticed the contraction. He had worked with Samuel Hart for 11 years. He knew the man's methods. He understood, with the terrible clarity that impending betrayal sometimes produces, exactly what the subtle changes in his operational role meant. Cole Vickers was being walked to the door. What Vickers did next was, in retrospect, the pivotal act in Samuel Hart's story. Instead of confronting Hart, instead of running, instead of any of the responses that a person with less institutional knowledge might have chosen, he went to the FBI. Not to Salt Lake City, too close to Hart's sphere of influence, but to the Denver field office. Through a criminal defense attorney who arranged a preliminary conversation in which Vickers' identity was protected until the terms of a potential cooperation agreement could be established, he brought them a map, not a literal map, though. The literal geographic information he provided about Hart's desert infrastructure was, for the investigation that followed, extraordinarily valuable. He brought them the intellectual map of the operation, the corporate structures, the financial flows, the key personnel, the relationship network, the history of specific incidents, including the 1983 disappearance of Jesper Crane. He laid it out with the precision of a man who had spent 11 years watching one of the most meticulous criminal architects in American history construct something, and who had paid close enough attention to reproduce the blueprints. Karen Daly. By 1993, a senior agent in the Salt Lake City field office was brought into the loop in late 1993. Reading through the preliminary debriefing materials that came through from Denver, she felt what she later described as a cold, almost physical sensation of recognition. The corporate structure Vickers was describing matched, in its general architecture, the anomalies she had been quietly cataloging for years. She pulled her legal pad from the bottom of a desk drawer. Samuel Hart's name, circled in pencil, looked back at her. The investigation that followed was one of the most complex and resource-intensive in the history of the Salt Lake City field office. It ran for 3 years, from early 1994 to the spring of 1997. It required the simultaneous management of a protected witness. It's an active physical and electronic surveillance operation targeting Hart's known businesses and associates, a financial investigation that eventually involved 14 separate forensic accountants working through hundreds of corporate entities, and the delicate political management of what was becoming, internally, one of the FBI's most sensitive active cases. Hart noticed. He could not have identified the precise nature of what was closing in on him. But the same instincts that had kept him invisible for 20 years began to register disturbance in the environment around him. Small things at first, a car he did not recognize parked too long near his office, a phone call from an associate that had an unusual quality of hesitation, a business meeting that was canceled without adequate explanation. He began to rotate his communications more rapidly. He moved certain assets. He increased the number of layers around his most sensitive operations, but he also, and this was the departure, the human crack in the inhuman discipline began to make mistakes. Stress, sustained over years, had done to Samuel Hart what it eventually does to everyone. It had eroded the precision. It had made him, in small but eventually critical ways, less careful than the man he had been at 30. He made a call from a line he should have known was compromised. He attended a meeting that, in his former mode, he would have proxied through a lieutenant. For reasons he never fully explained even to himself, a set of physical records. In a locked storage unit in the Utah desert, records that constituted the closest thing to a complete operational map of his empire that had ever existed in a single location. He kept them because he could not, in the end, bear to destroy them. Destroy them and the thing he had built, the architectural wonder. The shadow economy, the 20-year masterwork, would exist only in the memories of people he could not control. Keep them, and there was some record of what he had done, some testament to the scale and sophistication of it. It was vanity, perhaps, or something deeper, the need of any creator to have some acknowledgement that the thing they made was real. It was the one human impulse Samuel Hart had never designed, a safeguard against, and it was going to destroy him. Asterisk April 14th, 1997 began as an ordinary Tuesday morning in Salt Lake City. The sun came up over the Wasatch Mountains with the particular clarity of a Utah spring morning, sharp-edged, brilliant, and cold. Temperature was 41 degrees. In the neighborhood where Samuel and Patricia Hart still lived, in the same modest house they had occupied for 17 years, the street was quiet. The school bus would come at 7:15. The neighbors left for work between 7:30 and 8. It was on the surface a morning exactly like every other morning at 5:47 a.m. 43 FBI agents and 6 Salt Lake City police officers, operating under 4 simultaneous federal warrants, moved on 17 locations across Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. The operation, codenamed Desert Sun, had been planned and rehearsed over 6 months. It was one of the largest coordinated law enforcement actions in Utah's history, and it had been kept so tightly compartmentalized within the FBI's organizational structure that the Salt Lake City field office's own administrative staff did not know it was happening until the morning it occurred. Samuel Hart was asleep when the agents came to his door. This fact that he was asleep, that he did not have advance warning, that the operation that consumed his destruction moved faster than his network of intelligence could respond, was itself a testament to the quality of the investigation. For 25 years, Samuel Hart had never been surprised by law enforcement. He had always known or arranged to know what was coming. On April 14, 1997, he did not know, and the sound of federal agents' fists on his front door at 5:48 in the morning was the sound of everything he had built beginning to fall. He did not resist. He did not make threats or proclamations. According to the arresting agents, Samuel Hart opened his front door in a bathrobe, looked at the assembled federal presence on his doorstep with an expression that one agent later described as almost contemplative, and said, quietly and without apparent emotion, "I'll need a moment to get dressed." They allowed him the moment. He dressed carefully, a dark suit, a white shirt, no tie. He kissed his wife, who was standing in the hallway, in a state of shock that would last in various forms for years afterward. He said 3 words to her that she has never publicly repeated. Then he walked out of his house and into federal custody without a backward glance. The search of the Hart properties took 11 days. The storage unit in the Utah desert, discovered through information provided by Vickers and subsequently confirmed by electronic surveillance, yielded what federal investigators later described in court documents as one of the most comprehensive, self-documented criminal enterprises they had ever encountered. The records were meticulous, coded in a system that took forensic accountants 6 months to fully decode. And they covered 20 years of operations with a completeness that was, in its perverse way, breathtaking. Samuel Hart had recorded everything. Every transaction, every relationship, every arrangement, all of it. Preserved in a system of notation that was simultaneously cryptic enough to require expert interpretation and complete enough to constitute, once that interpretation was accomplished, a virtually comprehensive map of his entire operation. The prosecutorial case that emerged from the evidence was staggering in its scope. Federal charges were ultimately filed covering racketeering under the RICO statute, money laundering in excess of $100 million across a 20-year period, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, tax evasion, obstruction of justice, and based on Vickers' testimony and supporting physical evidence, the murder of Jesper Crane, whose remains were eventually located on a remote desert property that had been among Hart's earliest real estate acquisitions. The trial, which began in early 1998 and ran for 11 weeks, was one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Utah's history. Samuel Hart sat at the defendant's table every day in the same careful suit, with the same composed expression, and watched the architecture of his life disassembled piece by piece in front of a jury of 12 people from the communities where he had lived and operated. It was represented by 3 of the best criminal defense attorneys money could retain. They worked brilliantly, and the legal arguments they constructed were, in some instances, genuinely compelling.
But the evidence was overwhelming. The records from the storage unit were authenticated by a parade of expert witnesses. The financial trail, reconstructed by teams of forensic accountants, was laid out for the jury with an accessibility and clarity that left little room for reasonable doubt. Cole took the stand for 6 days, and while his testimony was the testimony of a cooperating witness with obvious self-interest in the outcome, the detail and consistency of what he described corroborated the documentary record with a precision that the defense was unable to effectively challenge. The witnesses who testified about the human consequences of what Hart had built, former associates whose lives had been consumed by his operation, individuals who had been on the receiving end of the operation's enforcement mechanisms. The family of Jesper Crane gave the proceedings an emotional weight that brought the abstract financial complexity of the case into vivid, painful human focus. Samuel Hart did not testify in his own defense. His attorneys made that decision, and it was the correct one. There was no version of cross-examination that would not have made his situation worse. But his silence in that courtroom, which had been his greatest weapon for 25 years, worked differently in the context of a jury trial. The silence felt, to the people watching it, like the absence of an explanation that ought to have existed. It felt like an acknowledgement that there was nothing to say. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On April 3, 1998, exactly 50 years, and 1 month after Samuel Hart had entered the world in a wind-beaten Utah town that had decided what it thought of him, the forewoman of that jury stood in a federal courtroom and read out the verdicts. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom, by most accounts, was quiet, not the dramatic silence of a gasped revelation, but the settled, heavy quiet of a thing confirmed. Samuel Hart received a sentence of 112 years in federal prison. He would have been eligible for parole after serving approximately 50. He would have been 101 years old. He listened to the sentence pronounced without visible reaction. He turned once and looked at Patricia, who was sitting in the gallery. What that look contained, only the two of them knew. Then he was led away. The desert phantom had been found. And the desert, which had kept his secrets for so long, had nothing left to hide. There is a phenomenon in the aftermath of great criminal prosecutions that is rarely discussed, but that people who work in law enforcement, criminology, and forensic finance encounter regularly. It is the phenomenon of the void. When a sophisticated criminal enterprise collapses, when the human machinery that kept a complex shadow economy running is suddenly removed, it does not simply cease to exist. It leaves behind a structural absence, a negative space in the landscape of relationships and economic activity that was organized around it. And into that void, inevitably, other things flow. Samuel Hart's conviction in April of 1998 created exactly this kind of void. The empire he had built over 25 years was not, of course, the kind of thing that could be seized and cataloged entirely. Formal asset forfeiture proceedings eventually recovered approximately $38 million in documented real estate and financial holdings, a figure that represented, by most analysts' estimates, somewhere between 20 and 40% of the empire's actual value. The rest had been distributed, moved, converted, or hidden in ways that even the extraordinary documentary record from the storage unit could not fully map. The human residue was equally complex. The network of relationships, obligations, and dependencies that Hart had spent decades carefully constructing did not dissolve with his conviction. Many of the people within that network had never been charged with anything. Their roles had been precisely the kind of auxiliary and deniable functions that Hart's layered operation was designed to produce. They remained in their positions, in their businesses, in their government offices, carrying the memories of what they had been part of, and adjusting their subsequent conduct in response to the lesson that had been delivered. Cole Vickers received a significantly reduced sentence in recognition of his cooperation, 12 years, of which he served 8. He was released in 2005 and disappeared into a federally facilitated new identity. His subsequent history is not publicly available, which is itself a form of testimony to the continued assessment of the risk his testimony had created. Patricia Hart divorced Samuel in 2001 from a distance without drama. She had, by that point, been through 3 years of financial devastation, assets frozen, attorneys' fees consuming what remained, the social and professional consequences of being the wife of the desert phantom rippling through every aspect of her life. She moved to a different state with her 2 children, changed her name, and built a new existence that she has, by all accounts, successfully maintained in privacy. Her children were 9 and 12 at the time of the arrest. What they carry of their father's legacy and how is not known. The physical infrastructure of the empire, the desert properties, the warehouses, the commercial real estate portfolio, was absorbed over the subsequent years by legitimate development. Some of it was acquired at auction by developers who knew exactly whose holdings they were purchasing and who understood the opportunity that presented. Some of it reverted to the state. Some of it was tied up in litigation for years. The 40-acre parcel of land south of Salt Lake City that had been Hart's first major real estate acquisition is today a commercial warehouse complex. Nothing about it announces what it once was. Samuel Hart himself served the first 8 years of his sentence at a federal facility in Colorado before being transferred in 2006 to a facility in Utah, a decision whose bureaucratic rationale was never entirely explained and which produced, in the circles of people who had followed his case, considerable dark speculation. He has given no interviews. He has made no public statements. In the approximately 27 years since his conviction, he has, by all available information, conducted himself in federal custody with the same quiet composure and controlled distance from the emotional turbulence around him that characterized his entire life outside it. There are people who study Samuel Hart's case, criminologists, law enforcement professionals, who speak about him with a reluctant admiration that they are at pains to qualify. Not for the harm his operation caused, which was real and extensive. Not for the violence that ultimately lay beneath the sophisticated financial architecture, but for the sheer intellectual achievement of what he built, the sophistication of the financial structures, the precision of the operational security, the extraordinary care and patience of the construction. In the specific technical literature of money laundering and organized crime, the Hart operation is a case study in how far one extraordinarily capable individual can take a shadow empire without access to the kind of institutional support that traditional organized crime provided. He had no family connection to organized crime. He had no mob affiliation, no cartel backing, no institutional framework to support him. He built everything himself, from nothing, using nothing but his own intelligence, discipline, and the particular cold patience that the Utah desert seems to instill in the people who grow up in its silence. He was, in some essential sense, a product of that landscape, vast, self-contained, impressively structured. and ultimately inhospitable to human life in the way it was organized, the question that people who know this story eventually find themselves asking is not whether Samuel Hart was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming and the verdict was just. The question that lingers, that resists easy resolution, is, what was this? What was the thing he was building, really, beneath the financial and criminal categories that the law used to define it? What did Samuel Hart want? He wanted to not be a victim. That much is clear from everything we know about his origins and his early life. He watched his father destroyed by forces he could not control, watched his mother's extraordinary capability trapped and wasted by the structures of her time and place, and he decided, at an age when most children are deciding which cartoon to watch, that he would not be a participant in those dynamics. He would be the person who controlled the forces. He would be in the vocabulary of the world he eventually built, the house. The house always wins, but the house, in this case, did not always win. The house sat in a federal courtroom in Salt Lake City and heard its own sentence read aloud. The house watched its entire architecture disassembled, documented, and entered into the public record. The house discovered, in the end, that the desert keeps no secrets from everyone forever, only from most people for a long time.
There is a specific kind of tragedy in the Samuel Hart story that is distinct from the obvious tragedy of the people his operation harmed, the communities where the drugs moved, the individuals who found themselves in the crushing mechanism of his enforcement apparatus, the family he ultimately sacrificed on the altar of an empire they never knew they were living inside. The additional tragedy is the one internal to Samuel Hart himself, the extraordinary intelligence, the architectural genius, the almost incomprehensible discipline and patience, all of it poured into a structure that, by its nature, could not stand in the light. A building that required darkness to exist. A man who could not use his most remarkable gifts in any way that the world could acknowledge, celebrate, or benefit from. What might Samuel Hart have built, if the conditions of his birth had been different? If Milford Junction had been somewhere else, if Eldon Hart had been someone else, if the particular intersection of poverty and geography and mid-century American reality that shaped the boy had arranged itself differently? No one can answer that. But the question is worth holding, because it is the question that every story of this kind ultimately asks, not just about Samuel Hart but about the systems and structures that produce people like him, that let the talent and the intelligence and the drive go dark because the legitimate channels were blocked by circumstance. The desert around Salt Lake City, where Samuel Hart built his phantom economy and hid his records and conducted the serious business of his shadow life, looks the same today as it looked in 1970 when he first walked into it. The red rock formations are unchanged. The silence between them is the same silence. The wind moves through the same narrow passages it has moved through for 10,000 years, nothing about it announces what happened there. The desert keeps its counsel. It always has. But we know. Now you know. And the knowing matters, because these stories are not just entertainment. They are maps of human possibility at its most extreme, most brilliant, and most broken. They are mirrors held up to systems and societies and individual lives, reflecting back uncomfortable truths about what we produce and what we lose and what we choose not to see until it is too late. Samuel Hart, the Desert Phantom, is still alive. Still in federal custody. Still silent, and somewhere in the Utah desert, in the spaces between red rocks and empty sky, the echo of what he built still moves in the wind. Quiet. Invisible. Gone, and not entirely gone, that, perhaps, is the most fitting legacy for a man who spent his whole life becoming a ghost. Final words: if you made it to the end of this story, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. You understand that history is not just dates and headlines, it is the texture of individual lives, the accumulation of choices, the slow weight of circumstance pressing down on human possibility. You understand that the most extraordinary stories are not the ones that were written to be extraordinary. They are the ones that happened in the silence, away from the cameras, in the desert where no one thought to look. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from and what time it is for you. I genuinely want to know. This community exists across every time zone, every country, every corner of the world, and every single one of you who watches and engages and shares these stories is part of the reason we can keep making them. If this story moved you, disturbed you, fascinated you, if you found yourself leaning forward at any point in those 7 parts, then please, hit that like button. It costs you nothing and it tells the algorithm that these deeply researched, seriously crafted stories deserve to be seen by more people. The like button is how you vote for this kind of storytelling.